Okay guys, so in the last video we talked about muscle contraction and we talked about all the different compounds and molecules and stuff that's important around muscle contraction. What we shouldn't forget about, however, is oxygen. Okay, now our muscles need oxygen. They can work without it, but only in times of desperation. So between oxygen and the energy that we need to consider those two different things, very important things in respect to muscle contraction. Okay. Now, the energy that we have in our body is basically referred to as that compound we talked about last video, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So this molecule has 3 phosphates on it, and it's the molecule, it's the bond between the second and the third phosphate molecule that has most of the energy associated with it. Once we remove that phosphate, then we go back to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and that's not quite a high as energy molecule. Now, we produce ATP by a process of oxidation. Now, oxidation of nutrients within the cells, it's commonly called burning, but it's actually a hydrocarbon combustion reaction. That's where we take a hydrocarbon, usually going to be sugars, so carbohydrates, or fats, lipids, and with the presence of oxygen, we convert those into ATP. Now, that's a really big metabolic pathway. We're not going to talk about it specifically in this course, but just know that we go from carbohydrates or fats and lipids to ATP through the presence of oxygen. So in order for muscles to have the energy they need to have those molecules, so carbohydrates, nutrients, and lipids and fats, for example, and they also need oxygen. Now, muscles will store oxygen and energy and nutrients in a bunch of different ways. So there's 3 more compounds now that we need to be aware of when we're talking about how muscles store products that they need. The first one is going to be myoglobin. Now, it's similar to hemoglobin, which is the protein in blood that carries oxygen. But myoglobin is specifically found in muscle cells, okay? So it's a way for our bodies to store extra oxygen in the muscles is in that compound called myoglobin. A second compound is called glycogen. The glycogen stores additional glucose, and we can break that down via, metabolic catabolism. That's when we take a big product and we turn it into little ones. When we need it. So think of glycogen as an energy store molecule. It stores glucose, and we can chop that glucose off when we need it so that we can convert the glucose with oxygen into energy, ATP. And the third molecule there, creatinine phosphate, that's a compound that's similar to ATP because it has a high energy release when we break the bonds. But we can also use this to form ATP when the muscles have used up its stores of ATP. So creatinine phosphate, we can use it as a energy molecule, but it's not as efficient and it's not as good as ATP. Instead, what we would do is when the muscles become very tired and they've used up the ATP that are present, then we'll use creatinine phosphate to make more ATP so the muscles can use that. So those are 3 more important molecules you should know when we're talking about how muscles conserve oxygen and energy. Now, there's 2 other things that we should be aware of. Is the fact that muscles can operate aerobically. Now that means with the presence of oxygen. So aerobic means oxygen present, or anaerobic, which means no oxygen present, okay? Now, if you're going around day to day and you're not doing any heavy exercise, your muscles are going to be functioning aerobically. That is, the oxygen you breathe in and circulates through your circulatory system is going to bring in enough oxygen to service all the needs for your muscles, okay? So that's regular aerobic metabolism, and that's the most efficient way. That's the way our muscles like to work best. Okay. However, if you're going to start exercising heavily, then you're going to get to a point where it doesn't matter how heavy you're breathing or how fast your heart's pumping, your muscles are going to run out of the oxygen that it needs in order to carry out those reactions that produce the maximum amount of energy for you. So what happens when we exercise heavily? First, we're going to use up the myoglobin. Then we're going to use up the creatinine phosphate and the glycogen stores. Those are going to be slowly chipped away until they're basically gone. So once they're gone, the body's still not receiving enough oxygen, or muscles, sorry, are still not receiving enough oxygen. The muscles will switch to a type of anaerobic metabolism, okay? So when the oxygen isn't present, the muscles will take glucose and it'll oxidize it using a different pathway, a different metabolic pathway. Now, this pathway will allow us to make some energy. It will allow our muscles to keep working, and that's would have been really important on an evolutionary time scale or an evolutionary basis. It would have given us the extra metabolism we would have needed if we were running away for a predator, or if we needed to sustain some, huge feat of strength. This would allow us to keep working. But as this anaerobic process goes on, what happens is we produce a byproduct in our muscles called lactic acid. Now, once lactic acid starts building up in your muscles, that's what causes your muscles to start to feel stiff, they start to feel heavy, and they start to actually hurt. It's this buildup in lactic acid that makes your muscles feel really, really tired. So the only way we can get rid of this lactic acid is by using oxygen. So what happens is eventually, once you stop exercising, your muscles will still feel really heavy and tired and painful. We need to keep having oxygen delivered to our muscles in order for us to break down that lactic acid metabolically and take it away as a waste product. So that's why if you're running really, really hard, for example, and your muscles start to feel really tired or painful, when you stop, your breathing and your heart rate doesn't go back to normal immediately. It takes, a couple of minutes or even 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how hard you're working, for your heart rate and your breathing rate to go back to normal. The reason why they stay up is because we need to get more oxygen into our muscles, even though we're not exercising. And the reason why is because we've accumulated an oxygen debt. And what an oxygen debt means is how much oxygen we need to get rid of that lactic acid that we created when we were making heavy exercise or heavy effort. And we exhausted the oxygen in the muscles. So that oxygen debt has to be paid off before we go back to regular aerobic muscle contraction. Okay, so those are some things that you should think about when we're talking about muscle contraction and certainly heavy exercise. Now, there are things that can happen when we exercise that will make us better at doing what we do. And you probably heard the expression practice makes perfect. Well, practice actually causes physiological changes as well. So if you exercise a lot, some of the things that you'll notice in your muscle tissue are an increase in the number of capillaries. Now that's good because there's more exchange places in the muscle tissue, more places for the muscles to get rid of waste, more places for it to absorb oxygen and nutrients. We'll also have an increase in the number of mitochondria, and you guys know that mitochondria are the organelles that produce energy, ATP. So the more ATP and energy we have in muscles, the better they're going to perform. And you'll also get an increase in reserves of myoglobin, glycogen, and creatinine phosphate. So those are 3 molecules that help the muscles store oxygen and nutrients. So all of these things would be an increase in the efficiency of the muscle, and that's if you practice and exercise constantly over a period of time. 3 main types of exercises that we would do would be stretching. So that's lengthening the muscles. That is one way that we can see these gains. Also aerobic exercise and resistance training. Okay, so aerobic exercise is when we don't use weights, but we do exercises that are quick and continuous, and we increase our heart rate and our respiratory rate. Resistance training, of course, is when you're lifting weights, you're lifting heavy objects, and you're challenging your muscles. Now, it's not just our muscles that change as we exercise. We'll also see changes in other systems. So we'll see vasodilation, and vasodilation is a way for our muscles to get increased oxygen. And vasodilation specifically means an increase in the size of the blood vessels. If the blood vessels are increased in size, it can deliver more blood, therefore more oxygen. We'll also see increased respiratory efficiency. So your breathing rate and your heart rate will eventually get a little bit better. If you've ever just tried running for the first time, you might find it really, really hard to run the first 500 meters. And then if you do that 3 or 4 times, you come back the next week and you find it a little bit better. And then the week after you find it a little bit better, and the week after you probably find it quite easy. And the reason why is because you have an increased respiratory efficiency. You get these extra capillaries in your muscles. You'll start to see extra mitochondria, extra reserves of myoglobin and glycogen, creatine. Your muscles get adapted, your body gets adapted to more and more exercise. Another thing we can actually see are physical changes in heart structure. There's an article that I posted on the news feed about swimmer's heart. And that's where exercise under the hydrostatic pressure of water can cause physical changes in the heart. And that's a pretty interesting article if you want to have a look at it. Now, we can also have different types of muscle contraction. We're only going to mention 2 in this unit, but there are several different types of muscle contraction. The first one we'll look at is isometric contraction. And with an isometric contraction, we don't see any change in the length of the muscle. What we do see is increase in the tension, okay? So we won't see any movement in this type of contraction, but we will see tension increase. So it's not something we can see, but it is certainly something we can feel and measure. So an isometric contraction would be if you're pushing against a solid object like a wall, for example. So the wall isn't going to move, but if you push against it, you are causing your muscles to contract, but there's no movement about that muscle. They're going to stay still. We're just going to increase the tension on them. We're not going to cause any movement. So that's an isometric contraction. An isotonic contraction is when the muscle actually shortens, okay? There may not be any change in the muscle tension. It may increase a little bit, but we will see this as a type of movement. So anytime we move the skeletal muscle, so running, walking, any movement of all, when the muscle, you'll actually see the muscle bulge when it flexes. That's called an isotonic contraction, okay? So isometric, there's no movement seen, there's a change in the muscle tension. Isotonic contraction, the muscle shortens, we see this as movement, and there's no change in the muscle tension. So those are just 2 types of muscle contraction. Like I said, there's many more, but you just need to worry about 2 of them. So the mechanics of muscle movement, well, we know that in order for us to move, we need to have muscles and we need to have bones. So the muscles are going to be attached to the bones via tendons. Now another word for tendons is aponeurosis, but I'm going to keep using the word tendon, okay? So the tendon is a connective tissue that connects muscle tissue to the bones, okay? Now, most muscles will have at least 2 or maybe more points of attachment to the skeleton. They need to be attached to the skeleton in order for them to create tension, in order for them to move the skeleton so that we can move. Now in the bones the long bones, if you think about the arms and the legs, for example, that's probably the easiest example. For each muscle, one end of the muscle is going to be attached to a relatively stable part of the body. And we're going to call that attachment the origin, okay? So the origin is the muscle attachment to the stable part of the body. And then we have the other end of the muscle is going to be attached to a freely movable part of the body. And that point of attachment is going to be called the insertion. So 2 attachment points for a muscle to the skeleton. One is a stable place called the origin. The other is a freely movable bone that we call the insertion point. So if we have a look at the biceps here, so this is the muscle of the upper arm. It's got 2 tendons that connect it to the scapula, which is going to be our origin, our relatively stable point on the body. And then we have an insertion point on the radius, the lower arm, so that when the bicep flexes, gets shorter, it raises the lower arm.